It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to such an incredible audience about global ethics and how important they are. I know you've heard lots of reasons why global ethics and our interest in them is so important as we live in an increasingly small world where we can travel to so many places these days, so much easier than we could in the past. And particularly for institutions like our own, universities in America that educate so many people from around the world and how important we are. And I know as a result of this, you hear that it's, as a university professor, as administrators of universities, we get so many students from around the world, and it's so important for us to understand global ethics because we get so many people from around the world. We need to understand them better and how they think, and really have a better understanding for where we are as Americans in this world and as professors in this world, and how our students will think and how people from other countries and cultures will think. What I want to do, though, is, you've heard all this. I want to give you another reason. A reason that's really based on my own research and someone who's been going to Asia for 30 years where I lived and studied. And particularly Japan and Korea, and for a smaller amount of time in Taiwan. Because I think our understanding of global ethics is so important for us to understand ourselves better as Americans. Because I think we underestimate that. We think we know ourselves. But what I'm going to tell you is I think we don't know ourselves well enough, but we will know ourselves better as we understand the rest of the world and strive to understand the best of the world. So, you know, some of the ways we see ourselves as Americans vis-a-vis other countries, things that I've heard and that we've all said, okay, might be not quite the whole story. And they might not even be 100% accurate when you think about this. And what I'd like to do is just give you some short illustrations from my own experience. 30 years ago, I went and lived in Japan for 2 years to study the language and to try to understand a country that I had been taught was inscrutable. A country that I was told that you can't understand Japanese people, you can't understand the way the Japanese government works or the way Japanese business operates, because we're Americans. And the reasons for this were really twofold. First, I was told that unlike the United States of America, we're such an open society, we welcome everybody, that Japan is a closed country. This is the first thing I learned before I went to Japan. Patterson, don't expect much because this is a closed nation and you're just not going to get as far as you are here. No matter how much you smile and how many jokes you tell, because, you know, all this kind of stuff, you're just not going to get as far along as you will if you studied the United States. Okay, fair enough. And also I said, you've got to remember, we as Americans, we believe in universal values. Okay? That we're a country that just expounds and, you know, exudes universality in the value systems that we have here, pro-democracy and other things. But Japanese, they're situational in their ethics. I was always taught this, situational. So if you're the enemy or you're somebody who might threaten their interests, they're going to apply a different set of standards to evaluate where you are vis-a-vis them. Then, if you're Americans, because we're universal, right? This is the way we believe in ourselves. We believe this about ourselves. This is what I was taught. So let me tell you something. Relative to the first point about the openness of Japanese society, first of all, I've been going there for 30 years, and my friendships there are 30 years old, back from when my graduate school days, when I studied with my colleagues who were very high up in the Japanese government. So there was a night that I was in Japan doing my research, and I was already a professor. I was teaching at Michigan State University, and I was invited over, and we were talking, and my friend came to me, who just happened to be an advisor to someone who was going to become the prime minister, and said, look, I got some friends here and they really want to understand how neoconservatism worked in America. And I met a bunch of guys, we gave our talks, my co-author of mine, he was an economist, so they asked him about the economy and they asked me about politics. We went on for about an hour of meetings, they took us out, everything was great. And the next day I heard the announcement of the formation of the Democratic Party of Japan. So here I am, some little American trying to get into the society. I'm on the bottom floor, the founding of a political party that would produce the next prime minister in Japan in 2012. That's what happened. So don't tell me that we're open and they're not, because openness is relative. It happens here and there. Okay? Japanese are about as open as welcoming as any country I've ever been in my life. And they still ask me things. You know, I'm happy for low standards, sure, because, you know, my opinion is just as bad as everybody else's. But, you know, this was a really, really interesting experience for me. Let me talk about another thing. When I first went to Japan, it was a very tough time in U.S.-Japanese relations. It was a time when Toyotas, if you were in Michigan, where I was teaching at the time, were being smashed. Actually, I was living in California at the time, but I knew I was going to teach in Michigan. Detroit auto workers were destroying Toyotas. There was the story of Vincent Chin, who was the Chinese American who was beaten to death because people thought he was Japanese and they were taking over auto worker jobs in Michigan. Okay, so this was a very tough time in Japan, and that's when I first went and lived there. And what I was told about Japanese attitudes toward trade openness and working with the United States to try to have a more balanced trade was that Japanese operate on situational ethics. We believe in the universality of open trade. We're Americans, we believe in openness, universality. So we're open in trade, Japanese are closed. Well, usually when I give this talk, I usually have a bunch of data that I gathered from public opinion surveys both in the United States and Japan, because I am what we call an econometrician and I do quantitative work. But I'll just summarize it up. When I looked at the attitudes of Americans and Japans about which country was open and whether or not openness for trade was right or wrong, what I found was just the opposite. Japanese said, yes, we protect our economy, and that's okay. Americans said, we don't protect our economy, we're open. And if we did, it'd be okay anyway. So the situational ethics are really tied up with the way Americans preserved our own, understood and perceived our own interests. So the point is, maybe we're not as universal as we think. Maybe we're a little more situational than we think, and it's only in our ideas and only in our efforts to go to other countries and truly understand who we are vis-a-vis someone else that we may understand ourselves better and strive for more openness and universality. I mean, I studied Asian philosophy, and I know Dr. Webb can speak to this a lot better than I can. But what I have found was that, we see ourselves Westerners. We're universal and open in our doctrines, and our politics is the birth of democracy. Yeah, but we weren't always democratic. We have to remember that about ourselves here in the West. Remember, it's the West that's the birth of the divine right of kings. Monarchies in Asia never based themselves on that concept. They based themselves on the concept of the mandate of heaven, which meant that if you didn't rule for the good of the governed, you would lose that mandate, and you would be replaced. We never had that in the West. The West was, my authority as monarch comes from God. That's very, very different. And one, in Asia is a lot closer to what it means to be democratic than it does here. Okay, we also are the founders of fascism and communism. Now, I agree that communism has been applied very effectively in countries in Asia, and it has been in the West as well. But remember, we haven't always been the way we think of ourselves as. And that's the most important thing. Let me close with one final point. How we see ourselves is also very much related to how we see others. And I think these two things work together. So when we say global ethics is really important, something we have to study because we need to understand others better, maybe we need to focus at home and say, through our efforts to understand others, we will understand ourselves better and understand ourselves much more realistically and much more accurately. Thank you.